Good evening, Link Sisters. It is my pleasure to be with you this evening, a bit early for some of you, late for others. And I am so happy to see you showing up. I'm getting some positive vibes in the chat and in my text. And we are here to talk about something very serious. But I want to just take a moment of joy to thank you all for showing up. I hear that there's over 500 people registered to be here for this very important conversation tonight. And so I just want to welcome you, Link Sisters. We are here to talk about stopping gun violence. And I'm going to outline for you the state of emergency. Many of you already know, whether you see it on the news, whether you feel it in your communities, but I am going to just lay out a framework for this conversation tonight. So you're going to hear statistics about how gun violence affects our communities, our children, our sisters, our brothers, more than any other demographic in America. You're going to hear that we're dying at alarming rates. We're committing suicide at record rates. And many of these issues occur because of the proliferation of guns. It's one of the most accessible items that you can get in America. As Links, in order to be effective in our communities, we have to be educated. These are not simple issues. They are not black and white, as many of the media outlets will have you to believe. When violence occurs, communities cry out. They call the mayor, the congressperson, and want to know, what is the chief of police doing about it? And yes, heavy is the head that wears the crown. But all of the underlying issues are not something a chief can deal with alone. And you'll hear more about that tonight. We know these issues are structural and start with a lack of food, a lack of opportunity, a lack of access to capital, good education, transportation, and yes, Link Sisters, we know even drinking water. Drinking water. The message to chiefs, though, is to get the violence down no matter what. And this sounds very simple, but implementation of it within your department is complex. But you will hear today that sometimes stops are necessary, but they must be constitutional. We must treat everybody with basic respect. And yes, we absolutely have to do something about violence. Because why? Because we are losing our lives at an alarming rate. But you also have the complexity of people calling for defund the police, abolish the police. But there are people bent on violence with guns, military grade guns that are sometimes more sophisticated than the guns that our police department has. And I can tell you right now, from my background and my experience, there is not a response from Ms. Johnson that's going to happen around community safety by herself. So we've got to figure out how we have that relationship with police who are constitutional and showing up in our communities the way we expect. And also, let's be clear, and Link Sisters, please hear me on this. When we hear that crime and violence is up, please know that some media use this and politicians use this to manipulate us and have a certain type of conversation. They're asking for more permission, for more stops, where profiling can be overlooked, where uses of forces can be increased. We know that violence is a manifestation of all the issues that we say as Links we are dedicated to working on in this world. And we have some great guests tonight who are going to help dissect all of those things I just threw at you and help us get educated, really parse out that nuance that we need to know, that we need to step with confidence when we're talking to our congresspeople, when we talk to our mayors, when we are in our communities. We need to step with this educated confidence to be able to make the change that we want to see in our communities. So let's get into it, Link Sisters. Next, I'm going to introduce to you our wonderful Eastern Area Director, and let's just give her a shout out in the chat if you can, for organizing this conversation and bringing such powerhouses to this conversation tonight. Our Eastern Area Director, Link Lisa Lori Lomas, is a PhD, is the 18th Eastern Area Director for the Links one of the nation's largest and oldest volunteer service organizations. You all know that. Dr. Lori Lomas is a member of the Columbia, Maryland Lynx chapter and is now the first in the Chesapeake Bay cluster to hold the highest leadership position for the Eastern area. Woo-hoo. The Eastern area is the largest of the 4 regional areas within the Lynx. Lori Lomas's demonstrated excellence and leadership and service is extensive. She has successfully served in various Eastern area key roles and has continued to advance in areas of responsibility accordingly. With her impactful focus, strategic vision, and team execution, mental health was integrated into the Lynx national programming under the Health and Human Services facet. Professionally, Dr. Lori Lomas is a licensed mental health clinician. We have all seen her bring her expertise to so many pieces of our programming, with an emphasis in human relations and development, mood disorders, trauma, and grief. And Lord, can we talk about that, Lynx Sisters? Dr. Lori Lomas holds a BS in psychology, an MA in clinical psychology, and a PhD in general psychology. Can we say that she has all the credentials? Yes, she does. So I'm going to turn it over to her, and I thank you for bringing us together, Madam Area Director.
Thank you so much. Thank you, my sister. And thank you to all who have joined us today. I want to thank all of my Lynx sisters. Special shout out to the Eastern Area Lynx sisters, all of our friends, family, and honored guests for joining us this evening for this very important discussion. Nearly every American will know at least one victim of gun violence in their lifetime. Over 1 million Americans have been shot in the past decade, and gun violence rates are rising across the country. In 2021, gun deaths reached their highest level in over 40 years, with 48,800 deaths that year alone. Each day, on average, 30 Black Americans are killed by guns, and more than 110 experience non-fatal injuries. Gun violence is the leading cause of death for Black males under the age of 55. And I'm a mother of 2 sons. And I'm sure many of you can appreciate how scary that statistic is. At least every other day, a Black person is shot and killed by police. These trends worsen in large cities where Black Americans make up 68% of homicide victims. And 60% of firearm homicide victims in the United States are Black Americans. Yet Black Americans account for less than 15% of the population. Young Black females ages 15 to 24 are over 6 times more likely to be murdered by firearms than their white counterparts. Young Black males 15 to 24 are 22 times more likely to be murdered by firearms than their white counterparts. And young Hispanic men are over 4 times more likely to be murdered by firearms than their white counterparts. You may ask yourself why. Why is there such a higher rate of gun violence incidents in Black communities? Well, social and economic inequalities are at the foundation. The root causes of gun violence include income inequality, poverty, underfunded public housing, under-resourced public services, underperforming schools, lack of opportunity, and perceptions of hopelessness. These factors underscore the need for policymakers to address the social and economic inequalities that impact violence. Tonight's discussion is certain to be robust, engaging, enlightening, and all of my friends and sisters, I hope motivating you to action, because it will take all of us to end this trend. Now, let me introduce our panel. We have Congresswoman Yvette Diane Clarke, representative of the 9th Congressional District of New York and co-chair to the Congressional Caribbean Caucus. Representative Clarke is a senior member of both the House Energy and Commerce Committee and House Committee on Homeland Security. Representative Clark has been a member of the Congressional Black Caucus since coming to Congress in 2007, and today chairs its Immigration Task Force. In 2021, Representative Clark co-sponsored legislation to reimagine the culture of policing in America with reforms to curb police brutality, end racial profiling, eliminate qualified immunity for law enforcement, and build greater trust between law enforcement and our communities. That was H.R. 1280, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2021. In 2021, Representative Clark also co-sponsored legislation to make it a crime to knowingly import, sell, manufacture, transfer, or possess a semi-automatic assault weapon or large capacity ammunition feeding device. This was H.R. 1808, Assault Weapon Ban of 2022. In June 2022, the United States Supreme Court 6-3 ruling that struck down the state of New York law that makes it a crime to possess a firearm without a license. Representative Clark issued a statement asserting that, quote, "It is truly unconscionable and quite frankly disrespectful that the Supreme Court would strike down a commenced gun law that protects the residents in a state confronting a serious crisis and uptick in gun violence." End quote. She is a force. We also have with us this evening Commissioner Danielle Outlaw. Commissioner Outlaw is an experienced and respected law enforcement leader. She stands at the helm of the nation's fourth largest police department, which employs more than 6,500 sworn officers and 800 civilians who work to help make Philadelphia a safer city. Commissioner Outlaw is the first African-American woman to lead the Philadelphia Police Department. A believer in the power of connectivity and continued learning, she meets people where they are, engages critics, and contributes nationally and internationally to ensure the department's narratives are accurately told and to benchmark against other organizations to ensure best practices in contemporary policing. Her overarching community safety goals are rooted in crime prevention and reduction, organizational excellence, and community engagement and inclusion. She has also presented on various topics, including race and policing women in law enforcement, de-escalation, and investigation of use of force, building community relationships after controversy, and video recording and policing and early intervention systems. She's been asked to provide technical assistance in areas of police accountability and risk management. Prior to taking the helm as Philadelphia's top law enforcer, Commissioner Outlaw was the chief of Portland, first Black woman to hold both positions. Welcome, Commissioner Outlaw. We also have with us this evening, Memphis Police Chief, C.J. Davis. Chief Davis has over 35 years of experience in the law enforcement profession, being focused on holistic interagency wraparound services and transformational policing for crime reduction. Chief Davis' research-driven work is strongly influenced by the practical application of the latest tools and technology, predictive policing, leadership development, and all important community engagement. She is a past president of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, NOBLE, and recently testified before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee on the matter of police reform in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd. She has since been featured on Good Morning America, CNN, and other networks as a subject matter expert on the important topic. Prior to Memphis, she was the chief in Durham, North Carolina, and retired as deputy chief from Atlanta Police Department. Chief Davis is also the first Black woman to hold both positions. Dr. Cicely Horsham Brathwaite. Dr. Brathwaite earned her PhD in counseling psychology from Temple University and her MSED in counseling and personnel service from Fordham University. She is a New York State licensed psychologist who specializes in helping women successfully navigate career and life transitions and improve upon their self-care. In addition to running her private coaching and therapy practice in Manhattan, Dr. Horsham Brathwaite works as an executive coach and an organizational consultant for nonprofit organizations. She has been featured in media outlets such as Entrepreneur, CNBC, Making It, Self, HuffPost, and the BBC World Service. She's the author of Better Daily Self-Care Habits. And our moderator, a highly sought after expert on police reform. Ganesha Martin's unique perspective stems from her experience working in local government working in the mayor's office, working within police departments, and now monitoring other police departments around the country. She regularly speaks and trains on Department of Justice consent decrees, police reform and accountability, and public safety. She is a member of the Council on Criminal Justice, an invite-only, nonpartisan organization and think tank for leaders in the criminal justice field. In 2019, she was one of 40 community policing experts invited to Nairobi, Kenya, to share community policing strategies during the convening on civilian police reform by Open Societies Foundation. She was also selected as top 40 under 40 by the International Chiefs of Police and the Baltimore Community Mediation Center's Advocate of the Year. Martin's expert commentary has been featured in the New York Times, Baltimore Community Mediation Center Advocate of the Year, Martin's expert community, the New York Times, the Baltimore Sun, CNN, and the Washington Post, among others. These women are truly dynamic, and we are lucky to have them with us this evening. And so I will now turn the virtual floor back over to you, Ms. Martin. Sit back, everyone. Get ready. It's going to be a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Eastern Area Director, and thank you again for being so thoughtful and bringing together this powerhouse of women. I see what you all are saying in the chat, and yes, we are very proud to have all these firsts on the call, and they will talk about the challenges of being the first as well, but they are leading with distinction, and we are just so happy to have them here. And perfect. I was just going to tell them that our the Congresswoman will be joining us in a second, and right on time. Here you are. We did have a wonderful introduction of you, and we heard about all of the legislation that you have pushed and the powerhouse that you are in trying to stop the proliferation of guns on our streets and save Americans, and particularly Black Americans. And so we're about to jump right into the panel discussion, Congresswoman, and you happen to be right here at the top of our questions here. And so one of the first questions we've talked about really just the epidemic of gun violence in our country, but we want to get to the underlying causes of this gun violence. And if you don't mind, share with us your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. First of all, let me just thank you, ladies of the Links, for inviting me to engage with you this evening on a very crucial issue for our communities. Gun violence is not only an epidemic here in New York State and New York City and Brooklyn, New York, but across this nation. I think, we have reached a tipping point in terms of the proliferation of available guns, and it is become a public health issue that we definitely need to fight against, rather. We need to do some work in holding gun manufacturers accountable, as well as change the ethos of a nation that has been wedded to a Second Amendment right in the Constitution that was written hundreds of years ago, but don't have a practical application in the lives of many Americans, particularly those who live in urban environments. So, what are the underlying issues, the causes of gun violence? And I think they're numerous. Number one, hopelessness. Number two, a misplaced sense of power. For young people in particular, it's the allure of seeming powerful and in control over one's possessions, one's body. For some, it's an issue of safety and trying to feel safe. For others, it's peer pressure and being caught up with peers who don't value life. There are a whole host of issues that I think cause gun violence. I think also it's community, home, and families. We have to be honest with ourselves when we see young people who sort of espouse violent thoughts, react violently to discipline or to their elders, encouraging them to be respectful, to have respect for themselves and others, and you get a backlash type of reaction to that. Something has gone wrong in terms of the ability for that young person to feel value in themselves and their communities. And so I believe that gun violence is something that is a manifestation of some things that are lacking in home and community that brings value to human life. In some instances, we have generational breakdowns where you will have perhaps a parent who's been incarcerated, who's been a gang member, and that becomes a way of life for the next generation. And part of that way of life is, gunplay. And so breaking sort of that mode is something that, we as a community have to find means of doing, whether it's embracing a family that has been disrupted by violence in the past, who have had sort of generational interactions with violence, and creating safe spaces and opportunities for young people in particular to seek other means of mediating disputes, of addressing circumstances of poverty that may encourage young people to take up arms, to commit crimes with, in order to, whatever the circumstances may be. Maybe they're following, as my mother would say, following fashion. And we need to break that. It should not be fashionable to be packing. It should not be fashionable to take someone's life in our communities. And so when I say, when you ask what are the underlying causes, I think that a lot of it has to do with exposure and what one is exposed to in their younger lives, in their early lives, in their childhood, and what young people are not exposed to, be it the arts, be it sciences, be it ways in which they can apply themselves in a productive and meaningful manner, contributing to building community as opposed to seeing themselves isolated and in a survival mode where it's me or you, against the world. Those are just some of the observations. Another underlying cause of gun violence is the easy accessibility.
That part, yes, absolutely.
To getting a gun. Manufacturers have flooded our communities with guns. Manufacturers, gun shows, that there's a long chain of custody that that ultimately gets the guns into the hands of young people, and young men in particular, young adults. And we've got to do more with respect to holding those gun manufacturers accountable, holding the gun dealers accountable, holding those gun shows accountable for the arms and munitions that they allow to get into the wrong hands, either unregistered, through straw purchases, a whole host of ways in which that easy access to getting a gun is an underlying cause. If it were more difficult, if you had to have a background check, if you had to be licensed and trained, because in other parts of the country outside of, I would even say the Northeast, there's a gun culture that goes to hunting, and at the end of the day, we want responsible gun ownership. And we're not getting that. We're being proliferated with guns.
Wow. I know Chief and Commissioner, but she hit it all. Did she not? Did she not run down the whole list? I mean, wow. And I just want to, I'm going to turn to you all to comment because she really hit on everything. But one of the things I want to uplift for our audience is when I was working in Baltimore, you had one gun store, but you had all these surrounding jurisdictions that had gun shows, and you literally have people come into East and West Baltimore with 50, 100 guns in their trunk and hand them out almost like candy. And so you have a situation where people are like, well, if they have a gun, that you're not going to catch me without one. And then when you have, you don't have the conflict management, then you end up in having all sorts of loss for crazy reasons. You looked at my girlfriend wrong. And certainly you can get more serious than that. But I would love for you all to pick up any of those strings of what the Congresswoman brought up and bring it to the streets, bring it to what you're seeing, in your daily lives. Help us understand that a little bit.
So, Danielle? Okay, so I was just going to say, Congresswoman, you hit every key point. You have stole the show already. We'll make you an honorary commissioner or chief because you definitely have the topics down. And I'm sure my colleague, Danielle, will agree that there's so many underlining causes to gun violence in our community. When you think in terms of why young people now are have an affinity for guns, and you think about ACEs, as we talk about adverse childhood experiences, that our children are growing up in environments where there is domestic violence, where there is community violence, where there is a proliferation of gun violence, and access is so unbelievable that you can go online and not only just purchase a gun, you can purchase what we call ghost guns now, where you can actually put together a gun as if it were a puzzle that comes to your home in a box. And you don't have to go in a store and purchase a gun. So we're seeing more and more avenues for young people and just community members to possess weapons and to use them. I remember days when you ended up in an argument with someone and you just go outside and duke it out in the street or whatever the case might be. Now everybody has a gun. Everybody, when you mix the use of guns or the possession of guns with alcohol and drugs and all the other things that we're faced with in our community, it just explodes and it becomes a real community health problem. I will say that here in the state of Tennessee, I've been here for about 17 months, but one of my gifts from the state legislature was for them to pass permitless carry in the state of Tennessee. And we immediately saw an uptick in gun violence. Guns are everywhere, and there has been a rallying cry for the state legislature to walk it back because unfortunately, minority communities are seeing the result of permitless carry. So I'll hold it there and let Danielle speak as well.
Thank you. I think I'll address it from another aspect. So one, I also want to thank the Eastern Area Links for the invite. It's such an honor to be a part of such an esteemed panel. And already, based off of everything that we've covered, Congresswoman, you hit it on the head. And I can't wait to hear what's going to come from the rest of our panelists here. But I want to talk about some nuances that we tend to forget. I remember at the end of 2020, actually throughout 2020, I started in Philadelphia about 30 days before the pandemic hit. And I put the pandemic in air quotes because that was, technically the official start time, the start date, right? And so when I was asked at the end of the year, what do you think caused the spike in the gun violence? I had to attribute COVID, right? And what we experienced during COVID. And of course, a lot of people rolled their eyes or said, here we go, you're making excuses. But we have to acknowledge that the book has not yet been written, right? And unless you've been a police chief or a superintendent or a commissioner during the Spanish flu, there's really not much you can tell us right now because at some points we were building the plane as we were flying it, but we're seeing a lot of what was already being experienced here. For example, all the social inequities that we sort of touched on already, and I know we'll go further in it to discuss them, were exacerbated during COVID. All of the, lack of access to whatever it is, education, food, housing, all of that stuff, healthcare was exacerbated, right? And we saw firsthand what happens when you lose all of your warm touch points. Here's where I'm going with this. Our schools closed. We saw backlogs in the courts. So people who would have had an open and shut gun case, for example, right? It would have been they would have matriculated through the court system. It would have been fully adjudicated. They might have been a felon in possession of, you know what I mean? They would have been a convicted felon. Now they have open cases. And so when we arrest them, because the previous cases hadn't been finished, it's not progressive, right? So we're beginning to see a revolving door. That's the one thing. It's important to talk about how the schools close because we're seeing an increase in our juveniles accessing weapons. What we're not talking about is how our juveniles also had now new money. There's this PPP money that was out there. They had more access to money they were getting on a weekly basis. They can now buy guns, they can buy drugs, all these things. Schools are closed. I don't know about you guys, but I remember 6th grade, for example, I put my clothes out the night before for the first day of school, right? And we went to school and we created whoever this personality was that we wanted to be in person. Schools closed. So a lot of who we are as young people or as individuals is being created online and digitally. And they're emulating what they're hearing in music. And again, I'm not the censorship police here, but they're emulating what they're hearing and what's glorified in music, what they see on YouTube. And that's who they're creating. It's not from the normal social human interactions that you and we all used to get when we went to school every day. It wasn't we got in a fight after school. There's a winner and a loser. Everybody goes home and we're friends tomorrow. There is now, you disrespected me on social media. I have access to these things that I never had before. I'm going to come back and shoot you. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but that's what's driving a lot of the gun violence that we're seeing. Social media beefs. Of course, there's narcotics behind it. It drove a lot of people indoors, the pandemic again. So we're looking at, domestic violence related issues, but a lot of it is around social media. So we cannot continue to ignore the fact that all of the things that already existed pre-COVID have been exacerbated. And there's these nuanced, incidences that have changed the way we have to police. Criminals have gotten a lot smarter. We're behind. Technology has changed. So we use data and intelligence to drive our deployments. We don't have blank checks. We don't have officers that we can put on every corner like we used to just for pure visibility. We have to be smart about where we send our resources. So we're using data and intelligence to tell us who are the worst of the worst, whether it's the individuals or the neighborhoods or the hotspots in our cities, right? So you might hear about focused deterrence or pinpoint, we call it here in Philadelphia, but it's all the same thing. But here's the question we have to ask. What happens when people aren't outside anymore? What happens when we don't have traditional gangs like there are on the West Coast or maybe in Chicago? So you don't have hierarchies, you don't have people at the top of the ladder that you can pick off. What happens when everything is moved to social media? That means police now have to train in a different way. We have to buy technology that we've never had before, which means we have to include that in our budgets well before. And we know how long our budget processes can take. It's like buying a laptop on top of that, right? We buy a laptop today and a year from now, it's already outdated. So the reality is that all of us, not just in law enforcement, but all of us have to update our software. I borrowed that phrase from a good friend of mine, but we have to rethink how we're addressing this because crime has moved, it's transient. You can't just pick off individuals anymore. And the worst of the worst now includes juveniles.
Yes.
And so when we say we're focusing on the worst of the worst because it's spear fishing, right? We're not casting wide nets and stopping everything that move anymore. We're focusing on those who we know have the largest impact on our citywide violence. It's a very small percentage, but they have the largest impact. But now they're juveniles. Those worst of the worst, typically what we do is we throw everything at them. That means we're bringing in the feds. The feds, folks, don't deal with juveniles. They don't have the capacity to deal with juveniles. So what does it mean when some of the worst now are juveniles? So I think there's some things that we have to think about and really truly focus on how the pandemic has not only shifted how criminals have adapted in their criminal worlds, but we really have to rethink how we're responding to crime and say, okay, are the models of the past the models that we need to be using today?
Absolutely, and I'm actually on site right now at a police department doing some reform assessments. And just today, the chief was telling me that they had a call last night, and there was an 11-year-old with an AR-57. I mean, which is as I said, it had to be as big as the child, right? And so we don't need to be scared of our children. Certainly trauma and as everyone has said, the life that they have seen since they came out the womb. It's probably lives that we can never even fathom. And so we have to find solutions to relate to and address that trauma. And I wonder, Dr. Braithwaite, do you have any thoughts? We talked about the pandemic. We talked about, all of this violence in our communities. Do you have any thoughts around these things from your perspective?
Mhm. First, good evening. I want to thank Dr. Lowry Lomas for the invitation here this evening. And it's an honor to be here with these esteemed panelists and our moderator. As I'm listening to each of you share your context, I very much am aware of the nuances that exist that often doesn't come to light when emotions are high about a very serious issue such as gun violence. This is a scary time to navigate the world. It's a scary time to navigate this country, our cities, our neighborhoods. And when you think about that and put into context that this is a scary time and we each hold different roles and positions, some historians would say to us that for as scary this time is, this is also a time in the history of the modern world where violence is actually less an issue than it was historically. I bring that up not to minimize the trauma, the terror that we experience in our communities. I bring that up to say that change is possible. And as a mental health professional, Madam Area Director would likely resonate with this as well. We often don't have the opportunity to determine who we think is someone who deserves support and care. And so when we think about trauma, I think it's important to recognize that trauma exists not just for the victims and their families. Trauma exists for perpetrators as well. Trauma exists for police and first responders. And until we take a public health approach and a human-centered and community-based approach to recognizing the layers and levels of trauma that exist around gun violence, it makes it very challenging for us to create the change that is necessary for these modern times. And that trauma looks like, perhaps I don't have other emotional resources to even get to the place where I can think cognitively and use my cognitive skills to think another way of dealing with conflict rather than retaliation. Trauma might mean, as was mentioned earlier, that I feel like I need to get a gun, as some of the young folks I've worked with over the course of my 20 plus, I guess it's 25 now, year career, where they feel that they do need to pick up a gun to keep themselves safe. And in those times, we know that folks aren't thinking logically. They're responding based on survival responses. And so what that means is that if we take an approach that is a public health approach that says we need to have services that support those who are both incarcerated, who have committed acts of gun violence, the family members of those who have been impacted, and using evidence-based approaches that solve those, that address those issues at the core, not just the symptoms, by also engaging folks in the community, not having folks who have no context for understanding these issues come in and tell people what is the best way to create change. There are individuals who chose not to pick up a gun. There are individuals who once did choose to pick up a gun and made different decisions later. And so I think that part of addressing that trauma is to speak about it, to continue to decrease stigma around receiving mental health support and services, and to be involved as a community so that we don't look at things as us versus them.
Yes.
Will not save us. As the Congresswoman spoke about earlier, what we recognize is that narratives are shaped based on what message folks want us to hear. And us versus them makes it very compelling not to actually look at root causes.
Say that, okay? Yes, absolutely. And I mean, madam, you put together I love how all of the experiences really are tying together. What I hope you hear, Link Sisters, is a overall message around how we have to approach these issues. And the doctor went straight to what's right now. It's been a best practice since the Boston Miracle in the 90s. But what the new term is right now is CBI. And this is something that President Biden is looking to put $50 million into. And, you know, this is a response that is not lock everybody up. It's take the data and understand who's shooting and who's being shot. It's usually the same people. Give those people an opportunity to choose a different pathway. And if you don't choose a different pathway, we know you're going to end up dead or in jail. But if you choose a different pathway, we're going to give you services. And these are not basic talk therapy services. These are services that helps build back that executive function in the front of your head when you have used and lived in a hyper-vigilant, violent, always looking over your shoulder. Literally, your brain deteriorates and you start making decisions without contemplation. And so, you know, we're looking to try to infuse funds and really into programs that undergird what Dr. Braithwaite just talked about. I wonder, Congresswoman, I know that you've pushed for legislation. Can you speak into at all what that's looking like on Capitol Hill, if at all, and just your thoughts around CBI, focus deterrence, those sorts of responses to gun violence? And then I'll come to the commissioner in chief about their thoughts.
Absolutely. And, our sister panelists just nailed it. We passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act into law, which really drills down into the mental health and healthcare, public health aspect of gun violence, and provides funding for a vital support systems for our communities. This is now the law of the land. It's at 30 years in the making. We have not done any real legislating around gun violence prevention in the United States over the past 30 years. And so, when we talk about, how to disrupt sort of a cycle of violence, it really means that we all become a part of the solution, and we don't isolate ourselves or turn a blind eye to families in distress, families with historic trauma, and we do go into our criminal justice system to begin disrupting what can be perpetuated if left untampered with. And that's why that Safer Communities Act, I think can be a game changer in communities across this country. The other piece that we're really working on is the assault weapons ban of 2022. There's so many types of weapons that people have access to, but we know that assault weapons, take people out in massive numbers. And it's ironic that when I first got to Congress, that was the sunsetting of the assault weapons ban that we experienced after Ronald Reagan was shot. During the whole Brady laws and everything that were put into place. And unfortunately, George Bush allowed the legislation, the law to sunset. With that, we saw the proliferation of assault weapons, weapons of war on our streets. And our young people are eager to get their hands on them because they are mass destruction. So that's just one piece of legislation. We're also facing a Supreme Court that has been an enabler, in my humble opinion, in terms of unfettered access to firearms in our country. When you have a 6-3 decision that struck down, for instance, the New York state law that made it a crime to possess a firearm without a license, has now opened the door in a highly populated and concentrated environment for all manner of access to handguns. Within that context, you're going to have, of course, an illegal trade of guns, notwithstanding the fact that people can now purchase guns here in New York State without a just reason. Prior to the Supreme Court's decision, it was very rare that you could actually purchase and own a firearm in the state of New York. You had to have a lot of qualifications for that. That has been ruled unconstitutional by our Supreme Court. So, we're like salmon swimming upstream in a flood of handguns. I think there needs to be some accountability from the gun manufacturing industry, and them having liability protection. It creates a whole nother dynamic where there's no accountability for what happens when these guns proliferate across our nation. And so I think that one of the other areas that we really need to be focused on is how to hold gun manufacturers, gun dealers, gun show operators accountable for when their weaponry end up, in the hands of young people, unlicensed and unaccounted for. Those are the main areas that I'd say we are working with in Congress. It was great to be able to get a bipartisan support for the mental health aspects
Mhm.
of what needs to be done, because this way we can drill down into our communities, work with our families that are in distress in many ways, and particularly single female headed households where
Mhm.
young sons are looking for guidance, looking for support, and that support may not be readily available. This new piece of legislation, well, this new law, would enable us to get the resources into our communities that we need to undergird those families and to provide them with access to information, to resource, and to support structures that open up opportunities to, put the firearms down, to break the cycle of violence that has creates the pressure
Mhm.
for young people to want to access guns, whether it's for their own safety or for the commission of a crime.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And again, you've hit on so many different issues there, and the mental health aspect. Particularly in our communities, and I think through the pandemic, we are getting better. We see Black women's health. I'm following all sorts of things on Instagram. The NAP ministry, okay. Rest is resistance. I know, Chief and Commissioner, y'all not getting no rest, but we trying to take a nap for you, okay? But we are really starting to see and understand the out in open public, how mental health plagues our community, and the police are being asked to respond and do more. Quite frankly, like the doctors on here, they need to show up with all the degrees and all the letters that you all have behind your name to deal with people in mental and behavioral health crisis. And that's just not how police are trained. But there is training that folks are trying to utilize to better, respond to these issues. And so I'll turn to you, Commissioner Outlaw, first. Talk about how you see mental health showing up in the work of your offline officers on the street, and if you also want to touch on your CVI and that's multidisciplinary response to violence.
Thank you. I'll actually touch on that last point first, because I wanted to underscore something that was said. Typically, or at least in the past, we'd be on panels and you'd have law enforcement talk solely about law enforcement. And then you'd have the services side talk solely about services. And then there's a new generation of police leadership, and you'll hear us speaking more of a comprehensive approach. A public safety is an ecosystem. And I want to underscore that. When you go heavy on the services side, it's not going to work. If you go heavy on the carrot, the carrot side is the services side, right? If you go heavy on the stick side, it's not going to work. There has to be a balance of carrot and stick. We've identified the worst of the worst, right? We've reached out to you. We've offered you services, and we've reached out to you because we know this is what you've been doing. What's it going to take to get you off of the street? Then if you continue to do, that's when we come in. If you continue to commit crimes, that's when we come in as law enforcement and we say, okay, here's the stick. We bring the stick, meaning law enforcement action is going to take place, and enforcement action of some kind is going to take place. There's consequences. So if there's no balance there, we see that the programs aren't as successful as they should be. And it doesn't help when, I've heard from the folks that are, our credible messengers, our boots on the ground folks that will say, I've spent 3 hours with this person. Thank you for calling us, but I have nothing to offer. Right? So
Yes.
we have to give our folks that are out there doing the work the resources that they need to get folks out of whatever situation that they're in. And it works the same way on the law enforcement side, right? You got to give it's interesting because we talk about defund, or we were talking about defund at some point, or abolish at some point. And here, part of that narrative in 2020 was defund, but we want you to have more training and we want you to have more equipment.
Mhm.
And I'm looking around like, does anybody else see how this doesn't quite add up, right? If we want our police to work at their best, peak performance, that means we have to invest and not divest. Tasers cost money. Training costs money. Equipment, state-of-the-art equipment, as again, crime begins to change. Staying on top of things costs money. Staying on top of changing expectations of community and what our roles are, those things cost money. So I think that we have to continue to acknowledge moving forward when we're talking about disruption and interruption and prevention and all these things, that it's a both and, it's not an either or. And
Mhm.
every time we have these conversations, it shouldn't be just the cops talking about law enforcement stuff and just the service providers talking about
Mhm.
we're all working towards the same goal, but typically we see folks at their worst. And given that we are first responders, if we don't make that phone call to our service providers as soon as we see it, sometimes it's too late. So I wanted to underscore that. There's a lot of generational trauma, specifically here in Philadelphia as well. And we have to acknowledge that. We have to know what we see when we see it and who to call when we do see it. The second part of that is it absolutely has an impact on officer well-being. And I would even say the professional side of the house as well, because our support staff work side by side with our sworn personnel. So all of this absolutely has an impact on our ability to perform again at our optimal level. What are we doing about it? Well, we saw in 2020 that a lot of folks were saying, we found ourselves on skirmish lines, and a lot of folks hadn't been on skirmish lines in a long time. And a skirmish line is when you see officers, lined up during civil unrest and typically facing those who are out demonstrating, and sometimes they'd be called everything but what their mother named them. And for a lot of people, they took that personal. Why am I being called a racist? Why is all this aggression towards me? I'm here to help. I'm not a part of this. And so we had to make sure that we offered opportunities to not only debrief, but debrief in a safe space. We have access to EAP, but cops are a personality. Are we really going to go? I can push out messaging all the time. Remember, this is here. Remember, you have to take care of yourself. But I also found that it was important to provide people opportunities to go on duty, to go have that time and that space to vent and to be heard, but then also make sure that we follow up with any feedback that we get. And if there's anything that I can do in real time to help address some of this stuff, to do that. But we've also noticed, and this is a very real thing. And some of you know me, I'm the one that says what's not in the brochure, right? And folks try to figure me out. Is she over here or over here? I'm not a political person at all. I like to say I'm common sense, right? And let's deal with what we know works, but also we have to anticipate what's coming around the corner. So what I'm saying isn't political in any way. But in 2020, we once again heard the narrative around defund or abolish. And I think we would all be remiss, given that we're all thought leaders here, in our roles as thought leaders, to sit back and think about the impact that had on our ability to perform our duties. And this is what I mean by that. We've done many things, trust me, to get in our own way, meaning law enforcement has. And sometimes I feel like, we've taken 20 steps forward and it takes one thing and it takes us 50 years backward, right? And so all of the work that we've done, investment in community, and the work that we've done to establish or reestablish or sustain trust, we lose it in in minutes. And so to the point that was made earlier, when we're in fear, when we're operating in fear, we tend to go to extremes. So it's either defund or get rid of, or go back to stopping everything that moves, which
yes.
which doesn't work, right? But as a result of the defund narrative, in addition to some of the things that we've done to get in our own way, I believe that it's taken away some of our legitimacy in the eyes of community, and therefore it's diminished our authority. Here in Philadelphia, in the time that I've been here, I've never seen and never had as many officers shot that I've had.
Mm,
And I paused there because it used to be, we would ask the follow-up questions. The first thing would be, are they okay? Second thing would be, were they in a marked car or in full uniform, right? Because we would say, if they had a gun, typically we would hear or see that people ran from us or something like that. But we're in marked cars. They know we're police officers. We're fully identified. People have been emboldened or feeling empowered. It's this misplaced sense of authority or power that people think they have. And for simply doing our jobs, I have an officer sitting in the hospital now, recovering from a shooting. Temple Police lost a police officer to murder. I mean, these things used to be once in a professional lifetime, and they're happening time after time after time again. So we have to think about, it's not just what can we do to boost morale and give cops all the toys and the fancy trainings, but what are we doing to say we support you, we respect you, this is still a noble profession, you are valued, and it's okay for me to publicly support you and hold you accountable at the same time. And I think that's what's missing there, because I appreciate folks saying, we want to get you more officers on the street, but we also need to recognize that, safety impacts morale. And I tell people, we don't sign up to do this to be martyrs. We're public servants. This is all about servant leadership. This is a calling, but we don't sign up to be martyrs. So I think there has to be some very serious discussion there as well, because this absolutely has an impact, not just on the mental well-being of our sworn professionals, but our support staff as well. And it's something that I think, again, there's no book written on this now, but I think it's something that we'll be seeing in the upcoming years.
Absolutely. And thank you, Commissioner, for lifting up all of those important issues. And I'd be remiss to say that we've had a record number of police suicides as well. And so again, we hear these conversations spoke about on media in sound bites, but you miss all the different layers and nuance, because it's difficult to deal with all of this. But that's what we're here to do, Link Sisters. But I want you all to be picking up on all of these different nuances and layers. And hopefully, as you go out to your community, you have these conversations, you can say, I hear you, but did you also know this? And did you also know that? So the conversation can get more nuanced and our solutions can get more directed at the issues. Chief, I don't know, do you have anything that you want to speak on as it relates to any of those issues?
Well, we're chock full of all kinds of, really, really good topics that we could talk about this all night. But what I want to take just a few minutes to talk about is a little bit that Commissioner Outlaw talked about, and finding that balance, because we have to fight crime, but at the same time, we have to ensure that our officers' wellness is at a place where they are serving our community and they aren't, acting in a way that they are the heavy hand in the community. I won't talk into details, but my agency has been challenged with that, and I have to ask myself, is this, a wellness issue in our officers? Is this a culture issue with our officers? Is this an isolated issue? We have great officers in the Memphis Police Department, and we have a crime issue that is the proliferation of guns and gun violence is just almost unbearable. And now, even with juveniles being a part of this equation, makes it even more complex. As Commissioner Outlaw touched on, you can't process juveniles the same way that you process older, adults. And at the same time, we don't want to throw our children away. When I stop an 11-year-old, I have to say, this is a baby. This is somebody's child, but this is the 6th time that we've gotten this child who was involved in some type of violent crime. So finding that balance and making sure that we look at our work and not compartmentalize our work, we have to think about what are the other resources and the other, entities out there that we should be talking to on a regular basis and connecting with. Danielle and I are an anomaly in this industry. You know, you're not going to see a whole bunch of chiefs that look like us, or even think like us, or might even respond like us, because we're invested in the community too in a totally different way. But we feel that our voices have to be strong as it relates to what that holistic approach is. It can't be just response. It can't be just lock everybody up. It can't be, you know, just get the drugs off the street and then everything is going to be fine. We have to talk about those underlying issues, those health problems, those children that go to bed at night hungry, those children that are home by themselves, those children that don't go to school at all and that are truant, and working with our school systems to also, you know, deal with this holistic issue of gun violence and all of the influences that support gun violence in our community. So from a holistic standpoint, trying to shift a culture in an environment that is traditionally just responsive, it's a heavy lift. It's a heavy lift to convince officers that, yes, you have to communicate in a way that you meet people where they are. If someone is in a situation where they don't have transportation to get where they need to go, or if they have transportation and they can't afford to put a tag on the car, then how important is writing that citation for that person? Because the only thing that you're doing is putting them in a worse situation. So trying to shift in the manner in which we, you know, do our work is really important, but it's really going to take a community in order for us to get where we need to be, in order for us to see suppression in gun violence. And I'll say this, and this past weekend was marked as the most violent weekend in the country in 2023 so far. There were more than 10 shootings, serious shootings in the country. There were 9 children that were shot in Georgia, 6 people were killed in Mississippi, 11 people right here in a club in the city of Memphis, 5 people were shot in New Orleans, and 6 people were shot in Chicago. So, and that's just half. That's not even the whole list. So when we think about not just the actors, but you think about the victims, I think in terms of what that is doing to our community, when you aggregate those totals and you have 6 people dead and you have 5 people going to jail, or you have 11 people shot and you have 3 other people going to jail, what that does to minority community is just, communities is just devastating. But thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this conversation. It's an important conversation, and I sincerely hope we have an opportunity to keep it going.
Absolutely. Well, I don't think y'all are gonna get away because you can see in the chat people are loving this. And again, unfortunately, we live this every day, but folks don't get to hear this nuance and get these sorts of details. And I think we have to be empowered with this information to make any sort of changes. I'm going to pivot to another piece of this conversation, but Dr. Braithwaite, was there anything you wanted to add to what has been said already?
We might get to this later, so I just want to give a smaller response. I'm really taking in the responses by our sister commissioners here sharing their perspective, and I was really touched by hearing Commissioner Outlaw and thinking back to when I worked in the counseling center at Temple University and needed to rely on Temple University police to support when there were critical incidents or students in need of support. And since that time, that was 20 years ago, having led college counseling centers and having to build strong relationship with public safety at the colleges in which I led was such an integral part to being able to have an opportunity to intervene so that things didn't escalate. And so what that leads me to kind of think about in this conversation is, for those of us who are listening, those of us as members of this organization, what's within our sphere of influence or control where we have opportunities to have more nuanced conversations as well as programming, as evidence tonight, that allows us to start to think about where are the places where there's opportunity for relationship, for conversation, for innovation. So that's what I'm sitting with, and that there is likely discomfort that sits in that, particularly when we bring in our own social and political beliefs, and what are the ways in which that and the place in which we sit in our lives influence our ability to have shared investment in reducing gun violence in our communities. So that's what I'm saying.
Well, keep sitting with that, because I'm keeping an eye on the clock. We have about 10 more minutes, and I am going to try to save about 5 for us to talk about what we can do, because I hope this conversation is activating your minds and your hearts to figure out a way that we can engage in our communities to help stop this epidemic of gun violence. I'm going to put 2 questions out there, and I want you all to just chime in where you feel like you want to. One thing that keeps coming to my mind is that we are in a retention and hiring crisis in police departments, where you have the chief and the commissioner have shifts going out short. And what that means is there's normally a certain amount of police officers that you need to patrol in an area. And when you don't have enough police, then that community is not covered. And sometimes violence can proliferate. But one of the things we hear from the community is we need more police that look like us. But I would put the spotlight on you, Link Sisters, to say that you might believe that, but how many of you would recommend anybody in your family to be a police officer? And so this juxtaposition of we want more Black police officers, but none of us want our family to be police officers. So that's one piece that I would like for anybody to address. And then the second one comes to me in the thought, and maybe Congresswoman, you think this is happening with you. There was a congressperson, I can't remember who it was, I was trying to Google it real quick over here, who said something like, when y'all stop killing each other, then come talk to me. So how they weaponize Black on Black violence to then just disinvest and disassociate in helping the gun violence issue. So if there's anybody who you want to speak on that piece, or speak on the crisis on retention and retaining and recruitment of Black officers.
Well, let me start by sort of addressing sort of the political dynamic, because I'm the only politician here that I can see. You know, at the end of the day, there's a perfect storm that is taking place in our nation, and it has to do with the marginalization of Black communities, and then it has to do with systemic poverty, and then it has to do with almost a conspiratorial type of turning a blind eye to gun trafficking at the federal level, straw purchases, and the type of policy decisions that are being made that we know ultimately accrue to, the continued proliferation of guns into Black and brown communities, and particularly Black communities, right? So working through the maze of political ideologies makes it even more challenging, because what it does is it freezes everyone. The trump card for a number of my colleagues is, well, we have a Second Amendment right. And once that is said, everyone freezes. At the end of the day, we have to talk about a 21st century society where gun culture has taken on a level of urgency around, when I say urgency, around dehumanization. I say that because we have not taken into account that the Second Amendment right was during a time where there was no military and there were militias. And at this stage, we have a military, we have a paramilitary, we have our police departments, and those are the individuals who are sanctioned by society to carry firearms for the safety and protection of the American people. At the end of the day, there's a segment of the policymaking class, if you will, that have decided that at the profit motive for guns trumps the poverty and the marginalization of these communities. And there's almost a reveling in the fact that we're seeing generation after generation getting engaged with a gun culture that doesn't value human life. And as long as it's contained to certain communities, it's okay. Because those communities don't hold the same value in our societal structure according to those individuals as others do. Be that, Black communities, be it LGBTQ communities, so that the different values are placed upon different human bodies. And yeah, I would say that that also perpetuates a self-hatred, right? Because at the end of the day, once the greater society doesn't value you, it makes it even more difficult in an impoverished, poorly educated environment. But for those individuals who are inclined to get engaged in gun violence, to view their victims as human, or to even view themselves with any level of empathy and humanity. And so we're up against a whole host of challenges where the value of the gun versus the human has taken us as a society, and it really is going to take all of us. And I'm so proud that the Links have taken on this issue, because at the end of the day, yes, our police departments need the help of the citizenry. They can't do this work on their own. We've got to stand up institutions that can deal with the societal traumas that have been taught. I really don't see our police departments having to take on sort of the social aspects of what is taking place. Yes, they have to be empathetic. I think they should be empathetic and should understand sort of the dynamics at play. But they need to be able to turn to some partners in the community and say, listen, we need you to stick on this, this particular issue with this family for as long as it takes so that we can break this cycle. Because I'm sure that our commissioners will tell you, they're seeing families going down this road of gun violence. And if we're not going to disrupt it at the family level, and I keep raising that because I'm from Brooklyn, and I at the end of the day, I see kids born into families that I know at some point are going to pick up a gun because of the violence that they're exposed to, the lack of support and guidance that they're given in their household. And so if we know as neighbors that something is going wrong, we need the resources. We need to face that before the NYPD does. In my case, and we don't have those resources in place. We can do it if we are willing to make the sacrifices, because it doesn't always take governmental funding. There are
Mhm.
some folks in our communities, there's some institutions in our communities that need to dedicate the time and make the sacrifice to
Mhm.
save us from ourselves. So when I hear a colleague say, well, when you Black people stop
Yeah.
shooting each other, I know what that's about. Because at
Mhm.
the end of the day, their desire is to see Black
That's
people
right.
shoot each other because they're
That's
not
right.
doing anything in terms of legislative or policy or appropriative means for some very simple things that can be done to assist in really abating what has become a runaway problem in this country.
Absolutely. Thank you, Congresswoman. And I was very ambitious on my time, throwing out 12 questions at once. I may ask just for some grace. We are literally at time. I may just ask for some grace for 3 minutes to ask Commissioner Outlaw and Chief CJ to tell us as links in our various communities how we can continue to think on this and show up and be helpful. The Congresswoman gave us some absolutely great ideas as well. But if you would just take 1 minute each and just lay it out there for us, anything that we can do moving forward.
I'll just hop in and be really brief. Community is some of our best recruiters when it comes to building a police department or an organization that reflects the community. And so when a young person or whomever says, you know what, I think I want to go apply to be a police officer, be encouraging and remind them that this is still a noble profession, right? And then before I turn it over to CJ, I just want to, throw it out there since I did mention him earlier in the call. I do want to offer my condolences to the family of Officer Chris Fitzgerald. We will be celebrating his life at the end of the week, but I just want to put that out there again. It's been far too many in my time here, and I'm hoping we never have to bury another officer.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, and to that point too, I think this is an appropriate time. We took one of our officers off of life support this weekend. He was shot in the head about a week or so ago in the commission of his job. So we've had some really challenging times here trying to, balance community and building the relationship with community, but also, facing the realization that violence is still very prevalent in our community. And this particular situation was one where this person was mentally ill. This was someone who had been in and out of the system and got access to, a lot of different types of weapons and used a weapon against one of our officers. So this conversation is certainly one that is appropriate for us to continue. I thank you all again for giving us an opportunity. I do believe that, making sure that we have officers that reflect our community is important. But as I have found, it's important to make sure that you have officers that have the right heart, the humane spirit to be a part of this work. I don't care where they're assigned or what type of work you give them. People who have a sense of humanity is who needs to wear this uniform.
Absolutely.
And and as I said, hurt people, and we have to dig deep and make sure that we have the right people in these uniforms. So thank you again for giving me an opportunity.
I'm so glad you uplifted that. And Dr. Braithwaite, take us on out with your last your thoughts.
I'm thinking about all of the the pieces that need to be in place to address all these issues. And I think the one thing that we can do is figure out a place in which we can contribute our time, talents, and resources. Today, those of us who are members of the Links received an email that it's Links at the US Capitol, where we have opportunities to advocate and to learn how to do that and to deepen our awareness. And in that, one of the ways that I would encourage from a mental health perspective that there is advocacy is that those who are service providers are also in need of support, given what they are holding up for those who are on the front lines. And so advocating for those to have those resources and support, I think, is also an important part of the picture. Thank you.
And like everyone is saying in the chat, this has been amazing. You all are excellent. It's been excellent. I am so proud to just look at this panel, look all around at all of this, the Black woman excellence. And I thank you. Without you all doing what you do, and then taking the time to come and educate us, give us the opportunity to go out into our communities and take this action and not let these be empty words, but take these actions and go do something. We have a lot of power. We have a lot of agency in this organization, and we need to use it. Madam, would you like me to just close that out, or would you like to say any final words?
I just want to say, wow, that I knew this was going to be a dynamic, engaging, phenomenal discussion, but you have exceeded my expectations. Thank you. Thank you for saying yes when I called you. Thank you for joining us this evening. I know you are all busy. Thank you for educating us. What I'm hearing is advocacy and responsibility. We are all responsible for one another, and we're responsible for our community and the ability for change. So I'm charging everyone who has joined us this evening to take action and to join forces with those who you are in community with, and we're in lots of different communities. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking time in your evening, and thank you to my panel. You're amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Be safe. Be safe.
Good night.